Welcome to the Certitude of the Catholic Faith. I'm John Veneri, and as you know, those who have been following this program, we are going through the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Particularly, we're going through the Catechism of Pope St. Pius X, which we hold to be probably the greatest catechism of the 20th century. And we're still in the very early stages of it. We're still in the beginning, of the Creed, where the Creed says, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Now, those of you who were with us last time, you remember that we paused a little bit to talk about God, the creator. One of the things that we pointed out is that science itself does not hold all the answers to understand creation. Science itself claims to be the be-all and end-all of all things, but science itself is dependent on a science that is outside of its field called philosophy and metaphysics. For example, and I want to preface this by saying that to say this is not to be against science, but what we want to focus on is the fact that certain sciences have to operate within their field, and we have to recognize when they're outside of their field and then what sciences they're depending on then. What I mean by that is we talked about the fact that science is dependent on the principle of efficient cause. Now, it's a fancy way of saying that for every effect, there has to be a cause. Now, that principle you won't find in physics. That principle is something you learn in metaphysics. I gave the example last time that in 1986, I believe, when the Challenger blew up, President Reagan, he appointed a presidential commission to find out what was the cause. He didn't set up a presidential commission to find out if there was a cause. We know every effect has to have a cause, but that itself you won't find defended in a book on physics, a book on biology, a book on astronomy. You only find that in metaphysics. So science itself is dependent upon metaphysics. Science itself is dependent on the principle of non-contradiction. The thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same circumstances. For example, I think we gave the example of potassium permanganate and glycerol poured together, and when they do, that will combust and eventually explode and melt the glass. Okay? That means that there is a principle of non-contradiction at work there. When you do that, that will happen. You're also saying when you do that, it means the opposite will not happen. So science is dependent on the principle of non-contradiction, something that's not found in the empirical sciences, something that we get from metaphysics. The reason I say this, as I said in the last class, is because modern science says it doesn't need philosophy. Modern science says it doesn't need metaphysics, and yet it is using the principles of metaphysics all the time. So we also talked about God as creator. The fact that creation from nothing implies, or actually demands, a power that is infinite. To create from nothing demands a power that is infinite, and creation itself tells us that God is almighty. It demands an almighty power. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole program last time to explain it. I'm just doing a little recap. But we're still on the point of I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. Creator of heaven and earth. Now, we know we get our story of creation from Genesis. In the beginning, there was nothing, there was the void, and God said, let there be light. God created the heavens and the earth. God created the creeping creatures. Then God created man and then Eve. Okay, now, here's the thing we're going to talk about in the next few programs. Excuse me. And that is that if you go to many people on the street and you will say, do you accept the story of Genesis? Do you accept that the God made the world, that he formed man out of the slime of the earth, that he removed a rib from Adam and then made Eve? The vast majority, I think, would say, no, I don't accept that. I don't think that's true. Why don't you believe it's true? Well, because now we have the science of evolution, which tells us that the story of Genesis is not true. But Darwin has told us that we are the product of this emerging evolutionary process from plants to animals to man. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because evolution has turned out to be the greatest cause of unbelief in the world. And evolution also is the foundation of our modern atheistic systems. Our modern atheistic world is dependent on evolution for its survival. And there's a lot to talk about. In fact, this is so vast a topic, so vast a subject, that we could have an entire series of programs on this topic alone, and I'm going to be dealing with it in maybe 2 to 3 to 4 programs, whatever we get through. And I'm just especially opening up the viewer that if you haven't thought about a challenge to evolution before, we're going to open this up to you so you can think about it. Now, I want to start with a story of Professor Maciej Giertych. I don't expect you to know who he is. He is a geneticist from Poland, a population geneticist. He has a degree from Oxford University, a PhD from the University of Toronto. He is a member of the Polish Academy of Sciences Committee on Forest Sciences. He's a member of those type of things. He, I think from around 2003 to 2005, he was a Polish member of the European Parliament. He's an accomplished scientist. So he tells a story of when he was in Oxford University in the 1950s. And in the 1950s, he was taught evolution. It permeates the sciences. It's just a given. They don't never necessarily try to prove it. They just assume it. They assume it as part of all the sciences. So he was taught evolution as part of all his science courses, and he accepted it without question. So what happened was, one day they had an auditorium at Oxford, and this octogenarian, that's somebody who was in their 80s, this octogenarian came to give them an auditorium, to give the student body a lecture, and the lecture was about evolution, and the lecture was against evolution. This old man was trying to explain to them that they should not accept evolution as true, that the evidence is not there. Well, they were polite enough to him, but they didn't take him seriously. Giertych says, we didn't take him seriously. There he was. We kind of felt sorry for him. He was stuck in the 18th century. And we just thought, well, he's just behind the times, or he's mistaken, or he's just stubborn. So they just dismissed him. Now, Giertych never really thought much about evolution again after that, until he became a father. As a father, he had children, and the children were in school, and the children had their science courses, and Dad, of course, was a scientist, so the children are going to go up to the father and say, Dad, can you help us with science? So he was going through their books, and in the science book, he read that the science of genetics proves evolution. Well, he did a double take with that. He said, now look, he said to himself, I might not know much about paleontology, and I may not know much about sedimentology, and I may not know much about astronomy, but I know genetics. Genetics is my field, and I can tell you that genetics does not prove evolution. In fact, if anything, it's an argument against evolution in a lot of ways. He said, I was aware that they try to use genetics to explain how the evolutionary process works, but I've never seen before, and I don't accept, that genetics proves evolution. So he goes into a whole explanation of that, which I'm not going to go through now. I'll go through in a future class as far as why the genetics disproves evolution or works against evolution. But what he says, he said, I had been taught that paleontology gives the bulk of the evidence for evolution, and to my surprise, the evidence is lacking. Because what he did is, he said to himself, well, if they're not telling the truth about my science, well then maybe what is said about paleontology is incorrect regarding evolution. Maybe what they say about sedimentology regarding evolution is incorrect. In the dating techniques, in fact, in all sciences, and when he examined it, he found that there really was not sufficient evidence in any of these sciences to prove evolution to be the case. And he has a wonderful quote here. He said, "A whole age of scientific endeavor was wasted searching for a phantom. It's time we stopped and learned the facts. Natural science failed to provide any evidence for evolution. Christian philosophy tried to accommodate this unproven postulate of materialist philosophies. Much time and intellectual effort went in vain, leading only to negative moral consequences." We'll be talking about those. "It's time," he says, "those working in the humanities were told the truth." So here is one of the many scientists who are working to at least show that evolution is not a proven fact of science. It is still an unproven theory. But what about evolution? Well, evolution right now, of course, as far as public opinion goes, and as far as the public trends in science, evolution sits in the temple of God and is worshipped as God. It is given the attributes that we always give to God: omnipotence and omnipresence. Omnipotence, because it's believed to be the creative and driving force in everything in the universe, without exception. You know, all creatures, great and small, evolution made them all. That's pretty much what we're taught. And omnipresence, because it pervades everything and is found everywhere. It's in the media, it's in education, it's in the textbooks. Again, look at the National Geographic and the nature programs. They just assume evolution, and it's even inside the Catholic Church. But what too many people don't realize, as I said, that evolution is not a scientific fact. It is still an unproven theory, and it's a theory that is finally being emphatically rejected by a rising tide of honest scientists. So we're going to take a look at some of what is said about evolution, and we're going to get hopefully a better idea, a better understanding of the fact that evolution is not really a scientific, a cold, hard scientific fact. Now, what is called microevolution is observable in science. It concerns relatively small changes that take place within a plant or animal form, but do not change the animal into something else. For example, the various types of dogs that we have. This is a variation within a species. Okay, it's within a species. But throughout all of this change, we'll just use the example of dogs. Without all the changes within the species, always remember the dog remains a dog. Okay, it's not on its way to becoming a giraffe. We don't see that in nature at all. Macroevolution is something quite different. It's the teaching that one kind evolves into another. The plant kind into the fish kind. The fish kind into the lizard kind into the mammal kind, the monkey kind into the mankind. This is what they call microevolution. And this has really no evidence in science, but what evolutionists tend to do is they will point to an example of microevolution, such as the various changes that takes place within the dog species or the cat species, and they'll claim that it's proof of macroevolution, that one species actually evolves into another. They're two very different things. Now, most people think that evolution is simply the teaching that man came from apes, but it actually goes a bit deeper than that, because if man came from apes, then the next question is, well, where did the ape come from? Well, from lower mammals. Well, where did the lower mammals come from? Well, from the lizards and the reptiles. Well, where did the lizards and the reptiles come from? Well, they came from the fish. Well, where did the fish come from? Well, they came from cells clusters of cells that had grouped themselves into colonies. Well, where did that come from? Well, ultimately, they came from one single cell. Well, where did that come from? You still have to keep asking this question. And here's the real crunch. The evolutionists teach that this one living cell just came by accident, by chance, through a lucky mixture of mud in a primordial soup, bubbling up and the lightning hitting at just the right time, and poof, all of a sudden we have life. In other words, from non-living matter. Now this is key. The key teaching of evolution is that life comes from non-living matter. The problem is we see this nowhere in nature, and it defies one of the most basic principles of reason. And this basic principle of reason and reality is that the greater cannot come from the lesser, a more perfect does not come from the less perfect, a being cannot produce an effect that is superior to itself. couple of very obvious examples, of course. None of us has ever seen a rock turn into a rose bush or even evolve into a rose bush, or if you leave a rock alone long enough, it turns into a rose bush. No, why not? The rock cannot give what it doesn't have. The rock is lifeless, and it cannot produce a rose bush because the rose bush is a greater form. It has life. The rose bush has the three principles of life, which is nutrition, it feeds, growth, it starts small and it grows, and generation, reproduces. The plant reproduces itself. The bush has those three things. The rock doesn't have it. The rock cannot give what it does not have. The greater cannot come from the lesser. Very simple principle. Going up the ladder then, a life form such as a rose bush cannot produce a greater life form such as, well, a mouse, something very little. Okay, we won't ask for a rose bush to go to an elephant. Rose bush to a mouse. Okay. Okay, now what does the mouse have? Well, the mouse does have those three principles of life. The mouse has nutrition, it has growth, and it has generation. Okay, the mice reproduce themselves. That's why you get rid of them when you see one in your house. They're going to reproduce, and they're going to take over the basement. All right, nutrition, growth, and resurrection. So they do have that in common with the plants, but what they don't have in common with the plants is a higher form, which is the 5 external senses, seeing, touching, tasting, smelling, and hearing, which the plant doesn't have. And also, we won't go into this here, we'll save it for another class, we also have 4 internal senses. In other words, when the 5 senses come in, they have to go somewhere. They go somewhere organic. That's the 4 internal senses. We'll do that in a later program. But anyway, the point is, the plant has nutrition, growth, and generation. The mouse has nutrition, growth, and generation, but something higher. It's got the 5 external senses and the 4 internal senses. The rose bush cannot give that to the mouse. The plant form cannot give that to the animal form because the greater cannot come from the lesser. You can't give what you don't have. If you are dead broke and someone says, can you give me $1,000? You say no. Why not? Because I don't have it. Okay? You can't give what you don't have. Now, the mouse or even the monkey that has 5 senses cannot then go on to turn into a man because, yes, it has nutrition, growth, and generation. Yes, it has the 5 external senses, the 4 internal senses, but man has what mice don't have and what monkeys don't have. Man has intellect and will. Now, I know there's animal activists running around saying, oh, the apes are intelligent. Oh, the porpoises can talk. We'll talk about that in a later program, too. That is actually what the animals do, is the operation of the 5 external senses and the 4 internal senses working together, including memory. Memory is part of that. But anyway, the monkeys do not have intellect. The mice do not have intellect. Man does. You can't give what you do not have. The greater does not come from the lesser. Okay? So this is just from principles of reason why a naturalistic Darwinian evolution really defies everything we know from reason and from the simplest sciences. The greater does not come from the lesser. Okay, that's that end of it. Now, what about evidence? Well, if this evolutionary process were true, and one species evolved into another over billions of years, then there should be an abundance of evidence for it in the fossil record. We should be able to follow the fossil records of evolution like footprints or like train tracks straight back to our origins. Our museums should be filled with thousands of these intermediate life forms, yet there are none. And to the contrary, all the life forms we have in the fossil record appear suddenly with no connection to each other. And it's also worth noting that man pretty much looks the same as the first time we see him, despite the artist's conceptions of the so-called monkey men. When you see these artist conceptions of ape men, they are only artist conceptions. That's really, I mean, it's really no different from a drawing of Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse, because every one of these so-called missing links, such as Java Man, Piltdown Man, Peking Man, the so-called Homo erectus, we'll talk about this in the programs, they've either been shown to be either all ape or all man. And as J. Wallace Johnson points out, a writer on this topic, there never has been found and there never will be found anything that is more than ape and less than man. Now, a piece of news that didn't get much press, it was in the press but it came and went, is that in 1980, Darwin's gradualism, which had species evolving one into another over a process of so-called billions of years, was actually rejected by a conference of top evolutionists meeting in Chicago because of the obvious and embarrassing lack of evidence in the fossil record. Yet despite this, evolution has still not been rejected, because what the scientists did is they replaced Darwinian gradualism with a new theory, with a backup theory, with something they can fall back on. And this theory is called punctuated equilibrium. Now that sounds impressive. Oh, punctuated equilibrium. But punctuated equilibrium is basically a theory that says that evolutionary changes happen so fast that they didn't leave any fossils. In other words, and J. Wallace Johnson points this out, I mean, it sounds kind of silly, but he points out that the basic teaching of evolution, of punctuated equilibrium, pretty much amounts to that a reptile laid an egg and a bird popped out. Now, this is pretty much the present state of evolution science, and there are a number of scientists who have fallen back on this position. They will not, the empirical evidence is not there, so they have come up with another theory that they think will, just to keep the theory alive. So why do they refuse to reject evolution outright? There's an evolutionist named Dr. D.N.S. Watson, and he echoes the sentiments of many evolutionists. He gives the real answer. He says, I'm quoting him now, he says, the theory of evolution is universally accepted, not because it can be proven true, but because the only alternative is special creation by God, which is clearly incredible. As I said, there should be an abundance of evidence for this. If it's been going on for millions of years, and as we're going to quote in the next program, Darwin himself said that it is essential for the theory of evolution to be true, it is essential that the evidence be there in the fossil record. I mean, the evidence should be so overwhelming that this has been going on for millions of years. If you want me to accept evolution, I'm willing to accept it. I think it's improbable, but I'm willing to accept it, but I'm going to demand a lot more evidence that you're giving me. Because if this is an evolutionary gradual process, then I want to see the entire transitional form of many different species. I want to see pre-turtle, sort of turtle, semi-turtle, almost turtle, turtle. And I want to see thousands of them. Remember, the evolutionists has said that this has been going on for millions of years. You shouldn't be able to walk through the park without stubbing your toe on one of these fossils. I want to see lots of these forms. I want to see pre-kangaroo, sort of kangaroo, semi-kangaroo, almost kangaroo, kangaroo. If that type of evidence was out there, I think we would have no choice but to accept evolution. But it's not. It's not out there. The fossil record is hostile to evolution. What it shows, what the fossil record shows, is really what we see in Genesis. Creatures created according to their kind. As I said, the fossils we see are animals fully formed, fully perfect, with no transitional to one another. And I want to close by making a point, and that is that I was talking about this one time, and I was accused of, they said, well, you basically think that scientists are evil, and that they're purposely trying to distort Genesis and send people to hell. I don't think that at all. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is that scientists formed according to an atheistic, materialistic system. They're formed that way, many are formed that way in their formative years, in college. And by doing this, just like Professor Dietrich, they develop lifelong habits of thinking within an evolutionary framework. Dr. Burnett, he's a professor of philosophy who studies these things, he points out that right now, 80% 80% of the scientists, especially biologists, 80% of biologists are atheists. The scientists are formed in this evolutionary thinking. They're formed in a system of materialism. They are formed in a system of gradualism. And they've just developed that way of thinking, and they just take all this for granted. So I'm not saying that these scientists are kind of, reading Genesis and saying, well, how can we disprove this? How can we disprove this? How can we? What we have is we have a whole new system that is taken over. And this new system that is taken over, as we're going to see in the next programs, is the number one cause of widespread atheism. When our Lord was on earth, he said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And he was predicting what the future was going to hold, that there would be faith, because he said that the church would be like a mustard seed that would grow very, very large, and its branches would take in all the birds, as it were. So the church would be a worldwide organization, a worldwide institution. And then towards the end, people would gradually lose faith. They would turn away from the truth. And he said, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? And to do this means, and to say this means, it's a rhetorical device, really, rhetorical question. It means he won't find faith. So evolution itself is the number one cause of atheism. There's a lot to talk about regarding evolution, especially a modern one, a modern discovery called Tiktaalik, this little fish that they claim is a transitional creature, and we'll talk about that in the next program.